Chapter 10. Urza got his wish. The Phyrexians didn't return to the cave the next day, or the next day after that. Seasons passed, and years. He dismantled the insect warriors, incorporating their parts into his redesigned dragon, linking their ring-shaped hearts into a single great power source. 10 years passed, 10 Dominarian years, according to Urza, who claimed his attachment to his birth world remained so strong that at any time he knew the sun's angle and the moon's phase above the cave he called Koilos, the secret heart. "Come," Urza said one winter morning, when Xantcha would have preferred to remain in her nest of pillows and blankets. "It is finished." He held out his hand, and with a rhyme and a yawn, Xantcha clasped it. No more screaming through the between worlds. She mastered her fears and the cyst in her stomach. Although she dwelt mostly in the forest where the Phyrexian portal had been laid out, and where a cottage with a chicken coop and garden now stood, Urza had insisted that she accompany him to every new world he discovered. Her nose for Phyrexians was indisputably better than his. There were no Phyrexians on the world where Urza had built and rebuilt his dragon. There was no life at all, and had never been. Urza's new dragon wasn't much taller than the old one, but he borrowed from the insect warriors. The new dragon had a spider's 8-legged body. Any 2 of the 8 legs could be the front legs, and any 3 could be destroyed without unbalancing it. The many-toothed head remained from the dragon's previous incarnation, but the short arms had been lengthened, and the torso rotated freely behind whichever pair of legs led the rest. In addition to gouts of blazing naphtha, the new dragon spat lightning bolts and spheres of exploding fire. "Float on," Urza said, rubbing his hands together. "Unlimited power!" Urza demonstrated each weapon, and though Xantcha still thought 100 lesser war machines would be more effective, she was awed by the destruction Urza's new dragon brought to the barren, defenseless world. The sky was streaked with soot and dust. Slag lakes of amber and crimson pocked the plains. Everything that wasn't molten had been charred. It reminded her of nothing more or less than Phyrexia's 4th sphere, and she didn't think even a demon could stand against it. There was only one not-so-small problem. "It's too big. It won't fit through an ambulator." "It won't need an ambulator. It can walk the plains directly. Even you could guide it safely." "I wouldn't know where to go." Xantcha had conquered her fears, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't orient herself in the between-world emptiness. World planes didn't call out to her the way they called out to Urza. If she lost her grip on Urza's hand, she fell like a stone to whatever world would have her. Urza's armor kept her alive through one failure after another, until Urza conceded that she'd never walk the plains. "You won't have to do anything at all," Urza assured her. "After I've used the ambulator once, I'll know where Phyrexia is, and I'll walk the dragon there. You'll wait, safe and snug, until I return. Now watch!" Between blinks, Urza shifted from beside Xantcha to the dragon's saddle seat. It came to life. No, not life, Xantcha reminded herself. Never life. The dragon was an artifact, the tool of Urza's vengeance against the abominations of Phyrexia. Never mind that its eyes went from dark to blazing, or that a ground-shaking roar accompanied each lightning bolt. The dragon was merely a tool that took aim at an already blackened hill and reduced it to slag in less time than it would have taken Xantcha to eat her breakfast. "Do you still have any doubts?" Urza asked when he returned to her side. "Mountains don't defend themselves." Urza took her words for a jest. His laughter rang between worlds as he whisked her back to the forest cottage. With the dragon finished, there was little to do but wait for the Phyrexians to return, and for Urza, waiting was difficult. Though he long since pried every story she was willing to tell from her memory, he continued to quiz her. How high were the First Sphere mountains? Where were the fanes, the arenas? Which priests were the most dangerous, and where did they dwell? Were the iron wyverns solitary creatures, or pack hunters? In the Fourth Sphere, were the furnaces clumped together, or did they each stand alone? And were the fumaroles wide enough to allow his dragon to descend directly into the interior, or would he have to dismantle Phyrexia like a puzzle box? Worse than the questions were the nights. About 1 in 4 or 5 when Urza closed his eyes. Urza's terrible dreams were too large for his mind. His ghosts walked the forest when he slept, recreating a silent drama of anger and betrayal. Xantcha had built the cottage to protect herself from his dreams, but no wall was thick enough to insulate her from his anguish. Urza's call for vengeance was something a Phyrexian could understand. From the beginning of Xantcha's life had been full of threats and reprisals, broken promises and humiliation. But Urza needed more than vengeance. When his nightmares reached their inevitable climax, he'd cry out for mercy and beg someone he called Mishra to forgive him. Urza wouldn't talk about his nightmares, which got worse once the dragon was complete. He wouldn't answer Zancha's questions about the ghosts or their world, or especially about Mishra, except to say the Phyrexians would pay for what they'd done to Mishra, or through Mishra. Zancha couldn't be sure which. Whenever she dared mention the nightmare name, Urza would fly into a bleak rage. 10 or 12 days might pass without a word, without even a gesture. Then, without warning, he'd rouse from his stupor and the questions would begin again. Zancha began to look forward to the times when the restlessness got the better of Urza and he'd head off between worlds, still hoping to stumble across Phyrexia or an excavation team with its precious ambulators. He'd be gone for a month, even a season, and her life would be her own. Long before the dragon was finished, Zancha had learned how to control the substance that emerged from her cyst and expanded into a buoyant sphere instead of the clinging armor Urza had intended. Seated in the sphere, she'd travel in a regular circuit of the hamlets and farms surrounding the forest, learning the local dialects and trading with women who accepted her claim that she lived with an old man in the forest. She still visited the local women, albeit carefully, lest they noticed that she wasn't growing older the way they were, but with Urza gone for longer periods of time, Zancha gradually expanded her horizons. She was, after all, following Urza's orders. He didn't want her to remain near the cave while he was gone. Urza reasoned that the Phyrexians might take her by surprise, extract his secrets from her empty mind, then ambush him when he returned. He designed an artifact that was tuned to his eyes, though small enough to be worn as a sparkling pendant. The artifact could send a signal between worlds. "Come back frequently," he told Zancha when he hung the jewel around her neck. "If they've returned, hide yourself far away from here. Then break the crystal, and I will return for our vengeance. Above all, once you've seen a Phyrexian, stay away from the forest until I come for you. Don't let your curiosity lead you into foolishness. If they find you, they will reclaim you, and you will betray me. You wouldn't want that to happen." 12 winters, 12 summers, and Urza still spoke to her as if she couldn't think for herself or hear through his lies. She swore she'd do what he asked. Whatever his reasons were, Zancha didn't want to come face to face with anything Phyrexian, even though she suspected Urza wouldn't come back for her after he dealt with Phyrexia. Urza's demands weren't a burden. The chaos and subtleties of born folk societies fascinated her. Giving herself to the world's wind, Zancha explored whatever struck her curiosity, so long as it didn't reek of Phyrexia's glistening oil. She learned to speak the born folks' languages, to read their writing when it existed. The warrior cave had 100 different names, all of them archaic, all of them curses. In the world's larger towns, where more folk knew their history, she discovered it was better to invent a completely false history for herself than to admit she had roots near the warrior cave. After a few narrow escapes and near disasters, Zancha decided that it was better to disguise herself as well. Born folk had definite notion about the proper places of young men and women in their societies, and no place at all for a newt who was neither. An incorrigible lad, a rogue in the making, was an easier disguise than a young woman. At best, when she wore a young woman's clothes, good-intentioned folk wanted to swallow her into their families. At worst, she'd be lucky to escape with her life. But Zancha did escape, and, hardened by Phyrexia, there was nothing in born folk's world that daunted her for long. The forest world had one moon, which went from full to new to full again in 36 days. The born folk marked time by their moon's phases, and Zancha did too, returning to the cave twice each month. Sometimes there was a message from Urza in the ruins of the neglected cottage. Sometimes he was there himself, waiting for her, eager to whisk her between worlds to witness his latest accomplishment or discovery. Urza had no one else. Although he said there were others who could walk between planes, he avoided them, and born folk alike. Without Zancha, there were only ghosts to break his silence. If anything would lure Urza back to her after Phyrexia, Zancha expected it would be loneliness. She pitied Urza. It seemed he'd lost more to his nightmares than he believed she'd lost to the Phyrexians. His artifact pendant was her most precious possession, a constant reminder that never left her neck. Yet, she was always a little relieved when she found the forest deserted, and except for one nagging worry, she would not have mourned the loss if Urza never appeared in her life. The worry was her heart, the lump Zancha had held in her hand when the vat priests decanted her, the lump they'd taken from her moments later, and they took it from every other newt. It had slipped through her memory some time after she'd become a Dodger, but it resurfaced when she encountered the Trian. The Trian believed that their hearts could hold only so many misdeeds before they burst, and consigned them to hell. To defend against eternal torment, the Trian purged their hearts of error through bloodletting and guilt dances. Urza had no more blood within him than a completed Phyrexian, but she thought the guilt dance might defeat his nightmares, so she danced with the Trian to test her theory. In the midst of hysteria and ecstasy, she remembered her own heart. Xantcha tried to convince herself that the tale of the Vat priests had told her was merely another of their countless lies. Her heart hadn't been very big, and no matter who might have done the counting, her or the ineffable, she made a lot of mistakes that hadn't killed her. But Xantcha had never been particularly persuasive, not with Urza nor with herself. For the first time, Xantcha's dreams were filled with her own ghosts. Newts and priests, a plundered wind crystal of music and beauty, insect warriors with baleful eyes, and even Gix, as the other demons shoved him through the fourth sphere fumarole. Worse than dreams, Xantcha began to worry what would happen if Urza succeeded, and all of Phyrexia, including the heart vault beneath the Fane of Flesh, were destroyed. She conquered her nightmares and worries. Obsession wasn't part of her nature. Still, when the time came, after nearly 200 summers of waiting, that Xantcha found diggers, bearers, and a handful of gremlin dodgers in the forest cave, she didn't retreat before breaking Urza's crystal artifact. Urza arrived with his dragon less than a day later and caught the Phyrexians by surprise. From her bolt hole in the hill above the warrior's cave, Xantcha heard the gremlins screaming and counted the flashes as the diggers and bearers exploded. A handful of diggers made a stand in front of the cave. Urza toyed with them, tossing each again and again before crushing it. It was a display worthy of Phyrexia and its cruelty and single-minded arrogance. Xantcha couldn't watch. She looked away and saw, to her horror, a searcher priest not 10 paces away. She thought it was hiding, though it was difficult to imagine any complete Phyrexian seeking shelter among living trees and animals. Then, insight struck. The searcher was fulfilling its destiny, watching an artifact Phyrexia would surely covet. Xantcha couldn't guess whether the priest had seen her before she saw it, but a moment later it began to run toward the ambulator, which it could if it had the time and thought quickly enough to unanchor and suck to Phyrexia behind it. Xantcha had no means to tell Urza that he was in danger of losing his way to Phyrexia, no reason to think she could stop the searcher priest or even that she could catch it before it reached the ambulator. But if it paused to unanchor the nether wren, she hoped she could delay it until Urza arrived. After a mnemonic yawn, she abandoned her bolt hole. The searcher priest had no intention of unanchoring the ambulator's nether end or even slowing down. It had a score of strides on Xantcha when its brass foot touched the black circle. With its second step, it crossed the midpoint and sank between worlds. Too fast. Too fast, memory warned from the back of Xantcha's mind. The priest had told them to enter the ambulator slowly, lest they get caught between two worlds. Expecting an explosion, Xantcha skidded off the trail and hid behind the largest tree she saw. There was no explosion. But when she poked her head around the tree trunk, fire rippled across the ambulator's disc surface. She had no idea if the priest had survived. For that matter, Xantcha didn't know if the ambulator had survived. Urza wouldn't welcome the sight of her, not when he told her to stay far away, but Xantcha thought it was best to warn him. She stepped in front of the dragon when it burnt a path through the trees. Urza shot flame to the left of her and flame to the right. Xantcha ran until she was breathless, then circled back. The dragon sat beside the ambulator. The saddle seat between its shoulders was empty. Urza had gone to Phyrexia alone. Xantcha settled down to wait. Morning became afternoon. The sky darkened, and the dragon's eyes shone red. Urza returned, not through the ambulator, but in a blaze of lightning, and Xantcha did nothing to attract his attention as he remounted the dragon. Moments later, they were gone. The storm ended quickly. The ambulator beckoned. It wasn't broken. For the last time, Xantcha asked herself, was her heart important enough to risk everything to rescue it? The priests lied about so many things, only a fool could believe they hadn't lied about Newt's hearts. Try as she might, Xantcha couldn't remember exactly what hers had looked like. Mottled amber, perhaps, with bright rainbow inclusions. She'd only seen it that once and never seen another. Only a fool, and she was a fool. On hands and knees, Xantcha crept up to the ambulator and was surprised to discover that the searchers had left the prime end in the forest. She began unanchoring it, careful not to disturb the hard panel where the 7 jet-black jewels were set in a silver matrix. When the ambulator was loose and rippling, Xantcha yawned. There was a single sharp pain in her gut as the cyst contracted. Drawing the armor out twice in a single day wasn't what Urza had in mind when he made the cyst, but she could do it 5 times at least before the process failed. The not quite liquid flowed beneath her clothes. She stepped into the unanchored ambulator. It swirled around her, not unlike the armor itself. By the time she'd reached the middle, the black disk had shrunk to half its size and risen to her waist. Xantcha had repressed how much she disliked the ambulators. The sinking and suffocating was worse than following Urza between worlds, and the cyst made the passage worse. It swelled in her gut. She thought she might explode before her head emerged in Phyrexia. Because she unanchored the prime end in the forest, the nether end in Phyrexia was also loose and shrank as Xantcha emerged. Any Phyrexian would have been suspicious of a newt who rolled up an ambulator behind it. The Avengers that normally guarded the fourth sphere field, where scores of ambulators were anchored, would have annihilated her on sight, if there had been any left standing. Xantcha assumed that Urza had annihilated them as he emerged. At least, something had. Waste not, want not. The fourth sphere was even uglier than she remembered, with acrid air and oily ash drizzling from the soot clouds overhead. The roar of 1,000 furnaces was less a sound than a presence of ice tightened over her ribs. The hollow where the ambulator had been anchored was bright with bilious yellows, noxious greens, and an iridescent purple that was the very color of disease. Nothing was alive, of course. It was just filthy oil, slicked over an eon of detritus not fit for even furnaces. There wasn't a living Phyrexian, newt or otherwise, in sight. Grateful but suspicious of her good fortune, Xantcha retrieved the glossy disk from beneath her feet, the rolled-up ambulator. Holding it by its flexible rim, she twisted her wrists in opposite directions. The disk rippled and shrank until it was scarcely larger than her palm, with the jewels protruding on the sides. After tucking the ambulator between her belt and her armor, Xantcha took her bearings. There was no sun star for Phyrexia, especially not here in the fourth sphere. Away from furnaces, light came harsh, constant, without shadows, but the place was home, or it had been, and it came back to her. A few strides up the greasy slope, the horizon expanded, and Xantcha saw why her return to Phyrexia had been so easy. Straight ahead, in the direction of the Fane of Flesh, the soot clouds had turned red, and fire fell from the sky. Urza? Xantcha asked herself, and decided it was possible that Urza was burning his way through Phyrexia. The ambulators could be anchored anywhere. Once unrolled, they were tunnels, direct passages from one specific place to another, no detours allowed. But a walker made his own path, here, there, and everywhere. Urza could change his mind between worlds, but whenever, wherever he ended his walk, he stood on a world's surface. In Phyrexia, the surface was the first sphere. When she dwelt in Phyrexia, before she'd known the meaning of silence, Xantcha had been able to ignore the furnace roar. She reached within herself to remember the trick and realized she'd been gone from Phyrexia several times longer than she'd been a part of it. But the memory was there. Xantcha numbed herself to the ambient rumbling and heard the clanging alarms. She smiled. Those alarms were struck when the furnace was about to blow. Every Phyrexian had an emergency place, and for newts that place was the Fane of Flesh, precisely where she wanted to go. Of course, the emergency wasn't a furnace, and the closer she got to the sprawled hulks of furnaces, fanes, and gremlin shanties, the clearer it was that, in the absence of the expected disaster, panic had replaced plan. Priests and other completed types that Xantcha didn't remember and possibly had never seen raced through Gremlin Town. Their voices were shrill enough to hurt. The challenge was staying out of their way. The shambles were already littered with gremlins who failed. Urza's armor protected Xantcha from the sky. Her sense of purpose did the rest. The Fane of Flesh wasn't the most impressive structure on the fourth sphere, but it stood near the glistening oil fountain, which had become a spire of blue-white flame. A phalanx of demons made their appearance while Xantcha threaded her way through the maze of furnaces. Narrow beams of amber and orange shot upward from their torsos into the reddest clouds. Urza answered with lightning. In the fourth sphere's filthy skies, the air itself ignited a web of fire shot to every part of the horizon. Xantcha felt the heat through her armor. Her instinct was to run, but ash quickly followed fire, and the fourth sphere went dark. For a moment, flesh had the advantage over metal, at least flesh protected by Urza's armor. Neither ash nor smoke irritated Xantcha's eyes, and with a bit of effort she could see a body's length in front of her. As in the Gremlin Town alleys, the danger came from the panicked and the fallen. No one paid any attention to a stray newt, assuming they could see her. Then the demons regrouped. A low humming sound began in the distance, followed by a cold wind that scoured the air. As it passed overhead, Xantcha looked up and saw the bottom of the third sphere, a sight she'd never seen before. She saw the flames, too, where Urza had burnt through the outer spheres. Another few moments and Xantcha might have seen Urza's dragon, if she hadn't started to run for the Fane. The rusty doors on the far side of the glistening fountain were wide open as Xantcha entered the plaza where the newts were completed. She was in the final sprint for the Fane when a vast shadow moved overhead. The last time Zancha had seen Urza's new dragon, she hadn't noticed any wing struts and had assumed the artifact had grown too heavy for flight. She'd assumed incorrectly. 6 of the dragon's 8 legs were highly flexible and maneuverable. The dragon swooped sideways to avoid a demon-flung bolt while belching a ton of flame. A furnace exploded. Metal shards and slag traced brilliant arcs beneath the third sphere ceiling. Impressed by beauty that was also terrifying and deadly, Zancha considered the possibility that Urza would win. Then a tree-sized clot of slag crashed into the plaza. The flames of the glistening fountain sputtered and died while yellow fumes rose from the new crater beside it. Unless Zancha wanted to die with Phyrexia, she had to find her heart and unroll the ambulator while there was still a solid place left to support the prime end. Zancha finished her run with no further distractions. "Down! Go down!" a jittery vat priest insisted as soon as she cleared the open doors. "Newts go down!" Its hooks and paddles clattered against each other as it indicated a deserted corridor. The priests weren't flesh, but they weren't mindless artifacts either. They might lack sufficient imagination to disobey a fatal command, but they had enough to be afraid. "I go," Zancha replied, the first time she'd spoken Phyrexian in centuries. She bungled the pronunciation. The priest didn't seem to notice. She'd forgotten how big the Fane was. Maybe she'd never noticed. She'd never gone anywhere within it without a cadre of other newts and priests surrounding her. One corridor was as good as another when she had no idea where her heart might be, and the one the vat priest had pointed toward was the broadest and best lit. She read the glyph inscriptions on the walls, hoping they would provide a clue, but they were only exhortations, lies, and empty promises, like everything else in Phyrexia. The Fane of Flesh was quieter, cleaner than anything beyond its precincts. Its walls had, so far, resisted the outside flames, but it had taken damage. Turning a corner, Zancha came upon a pile of rubble from a collapsed ceiling and a defunct vat priest crushed beneath it. She wrenched one of the priest's long hooks from its shoulder socket and kept going. A teacher priest waited at another corner. Its eyes were flesh within a flat bronze mask. They darted between the hook, Zancha's face, her boots, and her belt. "Newt?" it asked. Zancha had taken the hook as a weapon, but the priest assumed it was part of her, that it and her leather garments were evidence that she'd begun her completion. "The hearts! Where are the hearts? I'm sent to guard the hearts." Flesh eyes blinked stupidly. "Hearts? What's the matter with the hearts?" "We are attacked. They are the future. I'm sent to guard them." "Who sent you?" it asked after another moment's hesitation. "A demon," Zancha replied. Small lies weren't worth the effort of defending them. "Where are the hearts?" The teacher priest continued to blink. Zancha feared it didn't know where the hearts were stored, not a confession one priest would want to make to another, especially another under a demon's command. It asked, "Which demon?" as thunder waves pummeled the Fane and rust rained from the ceiling. Zancha had no time to wonder whether the strike was for Urza or against him. Gix was dead, thrust through a fumarole centuries ago. Still, any answer was better than none. "The great Gix sent me." Her bluff worked. The teacher priest just needed a name. It quaked as it gave her detailed directions to a vault so far beneath the 4th sphere floor it might actually have been on the 5th. More blasts shook the Fane. A stairway she was supposed to use was clogged with debris and the scent of fire. "I'll have to tell Urza he's wrong," Zancha complained as she put her hand on the portal artifact tucked beneath her belt. "I wouldn't be standing here waiting to die if I didn't have some damn fooled, useless imagination." She could have gotten out. The corridor was wide enough to unroll the portal. She'd be back in the forest. Safe, or not safe, ambulators could only be rolled up from their prime end. If she left the ambulator's prime end here in the corridor and the Fane collapsed, the rubble might follow her to the forest. All of Phyrexia might follow her. Waste not, want not. I never thought of that. When she used the ambulator to escape, it would be a 3-step process. First to the forest to anchor the nether end, back to Phyrexia to loosen the prime, and then another passage back to the forest. Timing had become even more critical. Zancha looked around for an intact stairway. She found one, and found the vault, too. Measured by the world she'd left, Zancha guessed she'd spent the morning in Phyrexia. Looking down at the mass of softly glowing hearts, she guessed it might take a lifetime to find her own. The Ineffable's plan for Phyrexia was precise, even rigid, but the plan didn't cover every contingency. Vat priests dutifully brought newt hearts to the vault, then simply heaved the little stones into a pit, one for every newt ever decanted. At the surface, the pit was about twice the size of an unrolled ambulator. When she thrust the vat priest's hook into the chaos, It went all the way to the shoulder gears without striking anything solid. The pit seethed. Countless glowing amber fists and a smaller number of dark ones were vibrating constantly against one another. On her knees, Zancha could hear a steady chorus of sighs and gasps. She wondered about the dark ones and got lucky. She heard a pop right in front of her, then watched as a glowing heart brightened, then went dark. Death? Phyrexians were dying in Urza's assault. Were their hearts, long detached from their completed bodies, going dark as they did? Zancha retrieved the newly darkened stone with the vast priest's hook. Tiny scratches marred its surface, marks left as the heart stone clattered against its companions, or a record of errors made by the ineffable. She read the glyphs on the walls. They repeated the familiar teacher-priest's lies. Zancha picked up a glowing stone. Its warmth and subtlety was tangible even through Urza's armor. She picked up a second glowing heart and found it was just as warm, just as subtle, yet also different. But every dark stone felt as inert as the first she had touched. The teacher-priests might not have told the whole truth, but they told enough. There was a vital bond between Phyrexians and their detached hearts. She hadn't been a total fool. There was good reason to rescue the stone she carried out of the vats, and precious little hope of finding it among all the others. Tears of frustration rolled down Zancha's armored cheeks. They fumed when they landed on the glowing stones cradled in her lap. Another shudder rocked the fane. When it ended, a score of hearts had popped and dimmed. More Phyrexian deaths to Urza's credit. But imagine what his dragon engine could do if Urza brought its weapons to bear where Zancha sat. Imagine what she could do. The hearts weren't so hard that she couldn't break them, and if her tears could make the stones fume, what might her blood do if she chose to sacrifice herself for vengeance? She'd be willing to die for much less before Urza rescued her, but she'd come to the Fane of Flesh because she wanted to live. Choices and questions, all of them morbid, paralyzed Zancha at the edge of the pit. And then she heard laughter. She scrambled to her feet, scattering hearts, crushing them in her frantic clumsiness. There was no one behind her. The laughter hadn't come from the corridor. It came from within her mind and within her heart. Throwing the hook aside, Zancha waded into the pit, sweeping her open hands in front of her, moving toward the laughter. She found what she was looking for not far below the surface, neither in the middle nor the pit's edge. There was nothing to distinguish it from any other heart stone, a few scratches, but no more than any other stone she touched, glowing or dark, yet it was hers. It had to be hers. Urza's armor absorbed it as it lay in her hands. Another burst of popping hearts interrupted Zancha's reverie. 100, perhaps several hundred. Phyrexians had died since she entered the vault, and the chamber was as bright as it had been when she entered. Zancha tried to calculate how many glowing hearts lay on the surface, how many more might lay beneath. She gave up after a few attempts, but not before she decided that unless she told Urza about the heart valve, it would be a very long battle before he achieved vengeance. Her heart was too big to swallow, too risky to carry in her hand. Zancha tucked it carefully inside her boot before she headed off. Finding her way out of the Fane was harder than finding Urza. Flames, smoke, and sorcery ratcheted through one quarter of what passed for the fourth sphere sky. While she'd be looking for a heart, the demons had mounted a counterattack. Urza's hulking dragon was surrounded by Phyrexia's smaller defenders. Dragons, wyverns, and whatever else had been summoned from the first sphere through the very hole Urza had burnt for himself. And she warned him. Individually, Phyrexia had nothing that could equal his devastating tool, but in Phyrexia, individuals weren't important. For every completed priest, even for every scrap-made digger or bearer, there were 20 warriors, fleshless, obedient, and relentless. The demons aimed the warriors at Urza's dragon, where they died by the score, and occasionally did damage. The dragon's wings were shredded and useless. 2 of its legs had been disabled. A third burst into melting flames, while Zancha looked for a path through the Phyrexian lines. Urza could still defend himself in all quarters, but when he lost a 4th leg, there'd be gaps, and it wouldn't take imagination to exploit them. "You're lost," Zancha shouted silently, adding an image of the vault of hearts. "There's a better way. Walk away now." But though Urza could easily extract thoughts from her mind, she'd never been able to insert her thoughts into his. There were hundreds of Phyrexians on the battlefield, and even a few gremlins. All of them were in greater danger of being trampled by the relentless warriors than they were from anything in the dragon's arsenal, but their presence, a thin layer of chaos across the field, was Zancha's best hope of getting to Urza. Relying on Urza's armor to protect her from everything except her own stupidity, Zancha dodged fire, lightning, and the distortions of sorcery as she threaded her way through the Phyrexian circle. Once she came face to back with a demon, it was dark and asymmetric, with pincers on one arm and six-fingered hand on the other, and it had eyes in several places, including the back of its head. Nothing like Gix, except for the malice and intelligence in its shiny red eyes. It studied her from boots to hair and Vat Priest hook. Zancha was sure it knew she wasn't what she was pretending to be, and equally sure Urza's armor wouldn't protect her from its wrath. Just then, a wyvern screamed, and the demon turned away. A wall of sharp, noxious yellow crystals exploded from the ground between Zancha and the demon. She staggered back and watched the demon uncoil like an angry serpent, writhing toward the dragon. Urza's armor protected Zancha from flames and emptiness of corrosive vapors, too. She followed the wall of crystals as it extended across Phyrexia's fourth sphere toward Urza and his dragon. If Urza struck down the wall, Zancha was meat. If he didn't, it would claim the fourth leg from his dragon. But not before she swung up into the leg's scaffolding, climbing for her life and his. Zancha made an easy target, running across the dragon's back, but nothing attacked. The Phyrexians overhead didn't recognize her as an enemy, and Urza's attention was centered on the noxious wall. Zancha fell hard when the leg collapsed. Worse, there was blood on her hands when she hauled herself back up. Either her armor was weakening, or Urza's was. She swung down between the dragon's shoulders, expecting the worst. Urza reclined in a wire-shrouded couch. Smoke rose from his charred trousers. The dragon's wounds were reflected on his body. Bruises, contusions, bleeding contusions covered Urza's hands and face. Zancha had never seen Urza hurt. She'd assumed he could be destroyed. She hadn't imagined that he could be wounded. She stood, confused and useless, for several moments before she found the courage to touch his shoulder. Urza, it's time to walk away from here, if you can. No response. Urza, can you hear me? It's me, Zancha. She put some strength into her hand. The whole couch rocked a bit, but there was no response from Urza. He was still in control of the dragon, still fighting, as mindless as any of the wyverns. Urza had abandoned sentience and become the tool. Listen to me, Urza. Vengeance is slipping away. You've got to leave now. Urza's eyes opened. They were horrible to behold. He started to say the one word that would have been more horrible to hear than his eyes were, but he didn't finish. Yogg, the ineffable. The name that must not be spoken. Zancha knew it. They all knew it. It was with them in the vats. But Urza should not have known it. He'd never gotten anything out of Zancha's mind that she had not been willing to give him, and she'd never given him that. Every instinct said run. Now, alone. Zancha resisted. Urza had rescued her when she had no hope. She wouldn't leave him behind. Zancha reached across the couch and took Urza's wrists as he so often took hers. She steeled her nerves and stared into his seething eyes. Now, Urza, we've got to leave now. Walk us somewhere safe, to the cave, where you took me, and leave that name behind. Yogg, Zancha! She screamed her own name in his face. His hands grasped hers and her vision went black.